Well, hey everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health one topic at a time. So today I have a brief follow-up video on vitamin D. I did one not too long ago where I talked about the benefits of vitamin D, and I also talked about my own experience using it in my own regimen. No sooner did I get that video up online than the results of a recent study were published demonstrating some concerning issues with vitamin D, and I want to talk about that too. So if you want to hear my follow-up, just keep watching. So I'm going to link the video that I did recently on vitamin D right here. Now, I think it wasn't up for maybe 10 minutes when the results of a recent study were published, and they got a lot of press attention, so I figured this is worth talking about. Now, in that recent study, they compared women in two groups, one group taking about the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, which I've said I think is really low, and the other group was taking a high dose vitamin D, like 4,000 international units a day. Now, I know I said in my previous video that that's the upper limit, like upwards of that is really considered higher than the safe limit of vitamin D, and I'm not recommending taking anything like that. But anyway, that was the comparison, and what they found between the two groups is that the women who took the higher dose of vitamin D actually experienced more bone loss at the end of the study than the women who were taking the RDA. Now, while that does sound concerning, my view on this, like everything else, is kind of nuanced. So first of all, this wasn't some kind of a prospective, double-blind, placebo-controlled study, which is by definition the only kind of study that can show cause. So what I'm saying then is that there's a correlation here. The women in one group having less bone loss than the women in the other group, there's a correlation between that and their vitamin D intake. However, you can't say that it's because of the amount of vitamin D that they took. So the women who took the higher dose, like 4,000 IUs per day, you can't say it was because of taking 4,000 IUs per day that they experienced that bone loss. There's just a correlation. Now, just to give a crude example of why correlations should not be viewed as causes. So looking way back in my memory, I'm remembering statistics class where I learned all about the different kinds of research. Correlations, there's lots of things that are correlated. For example, there is a correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime. That doesn't mean that one causes the other. Selling ice cream doesn't cause violent crime. So the reason for that correlation is that they both go up in the summertime, I guess, when people are out and about and there's more people sort of bumping into each other. So there's more people buying ice cream outside. There's also more violent crime being committed because there's more opportunity for victims to meet their perpetrators. So correlations, I think, end up getting a lot more press than they deserve. So this particular study with the vitamin D showed a correlation. Fine. I believe that there is way too much sort of pop science. Every other day there's a new headline. This is associated with this, and that's associated with that. And I think that this is just another example of that. That's not to say I'm discounting this correlation, and I will get to whether I've done anything differently in my routine shortly, and it's not a whole lot, by the way. But just off the top of my head, I can think of a reason that these two would be correlated. So here's one explanation off the top of my head that I think is not only possible, I believe it's likely. When you have people taking a very high dose vitamin D, there's usually a reason, okay? These are not people who are just taking a multivitamin. I think that overrepresented in the group taking the RDA are probably a number of people who are just not paying much attention to this at all and just taking a multivitamin, which has the RDA of vitamin D. On the other hand, if you survey a sampling of people are just around this country, around the world, who are taking something like 4,000 IUs of vitamin D, there's usually some reason they're taking that. These are people who have actively sought out that high dose vitamin D. This isn't a mindless multivitamin intake of vitamin D. This is something that people have decided they're going to do. And I think overrepresented in that group is people who are concerned for one reason or another about their bone health. Perhaps people who have already been diagnosed with osteopenia. Perhaps people who have mothers who had osteoporosis, and these women are now concerned about developing osteoporosis themselves. Any number of reasons. In summary, I just think that you're going to have an overrepresentation of people who already are prone to bone loss in that group of people taking upwards of 4,000 IUs per day of vitamin D. I don't get too excited about these correlations. Again, I think this is sort of what I call pop science, or, every other day there's a correlation here and there. And I think if you don't know better, you think of this as causal, and you could be just turning around 180 degrees on every one of your decisions every other day. So the next question is whether I'm going to change anything in my vitamin D regimen, because here I just talked about it. Well, not a whole lot. One thing that I might do is stop taking, even though I take only 3 times a week, I have a high dose vitamin D in an oil drop. So it's 5,000 IUs in a drop, and I take a drop 3 times a week. So really that comes out to be just a little over 2,000 IUs per day. And I bought that bottle because actually what I was looking for at the time, which was something I think was 1,000 IUs in a drop, and I would of course take more of it, that was not in stock. At the time I needed to replenish my vitamin D. So I went ahead and bought this one and decided I was just going to use a dropful 3 times a week. I think I'm going to stop doing that. I think that maybe there is something about that really high dose at a time. I had already mentioned that in my previous video, and this sort of maybe drives that point home. So I think I'm going to just go to taking about 2,000 per day instead of taking 15,000 per week. Now, in the end of a week, that's not a change, right? Because it's about the same amount that I'm taking. I do want to say that one thing that I think is a huge problem with these kinds of studies where they look at what people take in is they don't look at the blood level of vitamin D. And I talked about that in my other video, and I am just going to dig my heels in on that. I really want to see some studies where they compare bone loss in a group of women who have a blood level of vitamin D at 60 versus 40. Now, there is some of that, but I guess what I'm saying is this notion of what you take, what you're taking in, and how it affects your bone loss, it's not something that you can generalize to people across the board. So if I take 2,000 IUs per day of vitamin D, I end up with a blood level around 70. I know I said in my previous video I try to shoot for 80. It seems that if I try to shoot for 80, I end up at 70, which is still in the upper end of the normal range, and I'm planning to stay there. I think maybe I'll stop shooting for 80. I'll just say I'm shooting for 70. It's probably better. But you could take any number of other people and give them the same amount of vitamin D that I take, and most people are not going to end up with their vitamin D at 70. They might end up with their vitamin D higher. A few people might end up with their vitamin D lower. So I don't think it makes as much sense to focus on the intake in light of the fact that A, we can do blood tests so we can find out the blood level, and B, what amount of intake correlates to what blood level is tremendously variable across different populations of people. So I think the only thing here that really makes sense is to shoot for a certain blood level and then see what your results are. So if you get DEXA scans regularly and you see that you've been maintaining your blood level at 50 and you're not losing bone, that would tell me that that amount of vitamin D is good. Now, the other thing that I take issue with this kind of a headline or a correlation that gets published as though it's causal and really great science, is that it also ignores all the other benefits of vitamin D. So I'm not only taking vitamin D for my bones. Bone health is one thing for which I take vitamin D, but there's also a tremendous impact on immune health, and I talked about that in detail in my previous video. And frankly, that's one of the reasons that I started looking at vitamin D for myself in the first place, because I have some autoimmune issues. And because of that, my doctor at that time went ahead and drew my vitamin D level, and it was found to be deficient. And that's another correlation, but that is highly overrepresented issue in people with autoimmune disease. So I think the vitamin D is very important for autoimmune function. So really, we just have to weigh all these things. Again, I'm not going to get too swept away because every other day I might see a new headline that indicates to do something else. And what I choose to do instead is look at the preponderance of the evidence, the evolution of my journey and where it's left me. Am I healthy or less healthy? Does the empirical data, like my blood work or any testing that I can do, indicate that what I'm doing is working for me? And I try not to get too moved by every headline. But that said, I wanted to get it out there because I don't think it's something to ignore. I do think, as I said before, that we have to be careful. Vitamin D is not like vitamin C, and you don't want to be taking too much of it because it can cause problems for you if you are. So that's my conclusion from this. This is just one more drop in a sea of information that I've got. So it's something I'll add into the mix. It's important. I won't ignore it. It's not a game changer for me. It's not really going to drastically change how I handle my own vitamin D regimen. So let me know what you guys think and let me know what you're doing about it. I'm really glad it came up when it did so I could do a pretty prompt follow-up on it. And until next time, be well. Bye-bye.